In 1972, on the feast of Saints Peter and Paul, Pope Paul VI gave a homily that sent a tremor through the Catholic world. He spoke of a deep, personal sense that, from some fissure, the smoke of Satan has entered into the temple of God. For the public, and for most within the Church, this was a powerful and troubling metaphor. It was a stunning admission from the leader of 1 billion faithful. Authoritative sources confirm the Pope was using a potent image to describe the widespread doubt, the bitter confusion, and the spiritual turmoil that followed the Second Vatican Council. It was a turbulent time, a period when the very foundations of the Church seemed to be shaking. Priests and nuns were abandoning their vows in record numbers, ancient traditions clashed with jarring modern impulses, and many of the faithful felt disconnected and lost, as if the compass that had guided them for centuries was suddenly spinning wildly. A feeling of spiritual exhaustion had settled over the West. The Pope's words gave voice to a widespread loss of faith, a sense that the spiritual fabric of the world was wearing thin, that a cold draft was blowing through the heart of the sacred. His words became a dividing line. For some, they were a validation of their deepest fears that the Church had modernized too quickly, that in opening the windows to the world, it had lost its sacred mystery and allowed poison to drift in. For others, they were an infuriating return to medieval superstition, a roadblock to progress and a betrayal of the Council's optimistic spirit. But for all, they were unforgettable. They hung in the air, a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. But for some, that metaphor wasn't nearly enough to explain the chilling reality they perceived. For a very small, hidden few, the Pope's words were understood not as poetry, but as a battlefield assessment delivered from the highest possible authority. It was a declaration of a war they were already fighting in secret, a war that was going badly. Over the years, those words became the foundation for a story, a legend you might call it, whispered in the quiet, shadowed corridors of the Vatican and beyond, passed down from one old priest to another, usually late at night over a glass of bitter Amaro. It was a story not of metaphorical struggles or theological debates, but of a hidden, undeclared war, fought by a handful of men whose names are not recorded in any official history, whose battles were waged in secret, and whose victories and losses were never made public. This was a story of a silent, desperate conflict against an enemy that was not supposed to exist, an enemy that had breached the very walls of the holiest place on earth. It spoke of an enemy that did not knock on the front door, but seeped through the cracks in the foundation. I'm going to walk you through that story. You will not find it in any archive or official document. It is a memory, an accounting of events that were systematically erased, scrubbed from the records with an efficiency that only an ancient and powerful institution can command. Think of it as a case study in how real-world anxieties and deep-seated fears can build a narrative more compelling and, for some, more powerful than fact. A narrative that a secret few believe to be the absolute, unvarnished truth. The story as it's told begins with a solemn vow of silence, a vow that I held for 40 years, a weight I carried through a long and quiet life. It is a vow that I am now, finally, choosing to break. I do not do this for fame or to cause scandal. I do it because my time is short, and I believe the silence has become more dangerous than the truth it was meant to contain. The quiet has become a poison in its own right. The protagonist of this story is not a warrior or a spy. He is an academic, a quiet intellectual. In 1981, I was that young priest. My world was the ordered, peaceful sanctuary of the Pontifical Gregorian University Library in Rome. It was a world constructed of books, of ancient texts, of the clean, cool logic of theology and philosophy. My days were spent in silent communion with the great minds of the Church. My doctoral thesis was on the concept of evil as a privatio boni, a privation of the good following the teachings of Saint Augustine. For me, the devil was a necessary counterpoint to the divine, a philosophical concept representing the absence of God. He was an idea, a literary device, a symbol of humanity's capacity to turn away from goodness. Not a literal entity you might meet in a dark alley or, least of all, in the sacred heart of the Vatican. Evil was an abstract problem to be solved on paper, a logical puzzle. I would argue with my colleagues over coffee that to believe in a literal, red-skinned demon with a pitchfork was to misunderstand the subtlety of God's creation. God is being itself, I would argue. Evil, therefore, cannot have its own being. It is a shadow. It is a nothing. Evil, I argued, was not a presence, but an absence, like darkness is an absence of light. It was not a living, breathing presence to be confronted in a room. My life followed a predictable, reassuring rhythm. Morning prayer, long hours of study, evening instruction, and the quiet satisfaction of adding another small brick to the grand edifice of human understanding of the divine. It was a clean, safe, and intellectually stimulating life that I treasured. That all changed with an unsigned summons. I found it slipped under the door of my small Spartan room at the seminary. It was a single heavy sheet of vellum that felt impossibly old to the touch, thicker and more textured than anything I had ever handled. It was sealed not with the familiar wax of a Vatican office, but with a strange pressed sigil I had never seen before. A key crossed with a sword, but inverted, pointing downward. The note itself was brief, written in a stark formal Latin that was centuries out of style, instructing me to be at an obscure address within the Leonine city at the stroke of midnight. There was no name, no originating office, just a location and a time. For a man whose entire life was governed by documented official procedure, by appointments and schedules, this was a jarring break from reality. My first thought was that it was a prank by my fellow seminarians, an elaborate and unusually detailed joke to rattle the studious academic. Some of them found my philosophical detachment amusing, but the sheer weight of the vellum, the authority in the ancient script and the strangeness of the seal felt cold and undeniably real. I ran my thumb over the inverted sigil. It was unlike any symbol in the heraldry books I had studied. A knot of apprehension tightened in my stomach. This felt different. It felt serious. As the day wore on, I tried to study, but the words on the page blurred. My mind kept returning to the strange note. The simple logic that had always been my shield now offered no comfort. Who would send such a thing? And why to me? I was nobody of importance, a student whose only talent was for dusty books. By evening, I knew I had no choice but to go. A deep, gnawing curiosity had overcome my caution. It was the same curiosity that drove me in my studies, the need to understand, to find the source of a thing. And this strange note was the most compelling mystery I had ever encountered. Following the cryptic directions, I navigated a maze of narrow, cobblestoned alleys I never knew existed, far from the grand, flood-lit public spaces of the Vatican. This was the city's ancient underbelly, a world away from the tourists and pilgrims. The air was damp and smelled of moss and centuries of rain. The address led me to a small, unmarked wooden door in a forgotten corner of the ancient walls, a place that felt detached from the modern world. It looked like it hadn't been opened in 100 years. I hesitated for a long moment, my heart pounding, then knocked, my knuckles echoing in the silent night. The sound seemed too loud, an intrusion. The door opened immediately, and an older priest stood there as if he had been waiting just behind it. He was tall and gaunt, with weary eyes that seemed to hold the weight of centuries of secrets. He introduced himself only as Father Marco, and beckoned me inside without a smile. The room was less an office and more a private archive, a library of the forbidden. Tall, dark wood shelves stretched to the ceiling, overflowing with not only leather-bound books, but also stranger things. Sealed clay jars with Latin inscriptions warning of their contents, silver boxes etched with symbols I did not recognize, and rows upon rows of case files bound in plain, stark black leather, each with a simple cryptic code on its spine. On one shelf, I saw a collection of what looked like simple farming tools, a sickle, a small hand plow, each tagged and sealed in a protective casing as if it were radioactive. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, beeswax, and something else, a faint metallic tang like ozone after a lightning strike. It was the scent of contained power. Marco was my entry point into a secret world. He explained that I was being vetted for a unit so clandestine its existence was, and has always been, officially denied, the Sanctum Officina, the Holy Office. This small elite unit, a team of priests, doctors, historians, and scientists, was described as the Church's paranormal investigators. In truth, their job was to be the final line of defense. They were tasked to sift alleged miracles from clever hoaxes and to distinguish the mentally ill from the genuinely possessed. They were the men who dealt with the events the official church could never and would never acknowledge. They were the church's cleaners, handling the messes no one else could or would. Marco did not waste time on pleasantries. He pushed a transcript of Pope Paul II's 1972 homily across his worn oak desk. "You've read this, of course," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "Yes, Father. It's a powerful metaphor for the post-conciliar crisis of faith." A flicker of something, impatience perhaps, crossed his face. "We are not poets, Father," he responded, his tired eyes locking onto mine with unnerving intensity. "We are soldiers in a war that never ended." That was not a metaphor. It was an alarm bell. It was a field report from the highest level. This is the central, shocking belief of the legend, that the Pope's words were a literal confirmation that the Vatican itself, the very temple of God, was being actively and strategically infiltrated by demonic forces. My skepticism, the bedrock of my intellectual life, must have been written plainly on my face. I probably looked like he had just told me the sky was green. A small, grim smile touched Marco's lips. "Good," he said, seeming pleased. "Doubt is your shield. It is the first and most important tool we have. We do not operate on faith here. We do not believe. We verify. Every other possibility, mental illness, fraud, political intrigue, chemical imbalance, must be thoroughly and exhaustively disproven before we even begin to consider the alternative. We have seen fervent belief lead good men to see demons in every shadow. That is precisely why you are here. Your mind has been trained to question, to analyze, to see the world through the cold lens of logic. We need that. We are drowning in frantic belief and hysteria. We need your doubt." He then slid a heavy, well-worn book across the desk. It was a copy of the Roman Ritual, the ancient tome containing the rite of exorcism. The leather cover was worn smooth in places, the pages softened by a century of use. It was a rite I had only ever studied as a historical curiosity, a relic from a more superstitious age. "Your academic career is over," he said, the finality in his tone like a vault door slamming shut. "You will not publish your thesis. You will leave the university. You will, for all official purposes, disappear into a quiet life of archival work. Your real education is about to begin." My first real test came less than a week later, pulling me from the theoretical and plunging me into a nightmare. The case involved a Cardinal Aluni, a fictional name for a very real archetype of power, rigid orthodoxy, and immense influence within the Roman Curia. The official report from his secretary cited a case of nervous exhaustion, a breakdown from the pressures of his high office. But the secret report that reached the Sanctum Officina, delivered by a terrified young aide in the dead of night, spoke of something far worse. The aide, a young man no older than myself, was shaking so badly he could barely speak. He talked of whispers coming from the cardinal's empty office, of a sudden biting cold that clung to the rooms, and of a look of pure vacant horror in his master's eyes. Marco and I arrived late, using a service entrance to access the cardinal's opulent apartment near St. Peter's Square. The moment we stepped inside, the air changed. It was thick and unnaturally cold, a damp, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the Roman night outside. It felt like walking into a meat locker. The signs of wrongness were subtle at first, designed to unnerve. A priceless Renaissance crucifix hanging on the wall was turned ever so slightly askew. A bowl of fresh fruit on a sideboard had withered and decayed as if left out for weeks. We found the cardinal in his study, a magnificent room lined with priceless art and books. He sat stiffly in his chair, staring at a wall, his eyes, normally sharp and piercingly intelligent, now flat, lifeless voids. He did not seem to notice our presence at all. When Marco placed a Bible on the polished desk beside him, The cardinal flinched with a barely perceptible tremor, as if from an electric shock. Then came the smell, faint but unmistakable, hidden beneath the scent of beeswax candles and old books. The sour, metallic smell of decay and sulfur. Marco began to pray softly in Latin, the opening lines of the Litany of the Saints. For a moment, there was silence. Then the cardinal's head snapped up, his neck moving at an impossible, sickening angle with a sound like cracking wood. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that did not belong in a human throat. "Silencio prete," he snarled, his voice layered and distorted, as if two distinct voices were speaking at once. "Silence, priest. We have authority over you in the name of Jesus Christ," Marco stated, his own voice calm but absolute. He calmly removed his purple stole, a symbol of priestly authority, and a small vial of holy water. The exorcism began. According to the story, this is the moment where my academic worldview was not just shattered, but utterly burned to the ground. The cardinal, a man in his late 60s and of slight build, exhibited a strength that was profoundly unnatural. It took 4 large, muscular Swiss guards to restrain him in his heavy oak chair, and still he thrashed with incredible force, the wood of the chair groaning under the strain. He began to speak, not in Italian or Latin, but in languages he could have no possible knowledge of. Fluent, mocking Aramaic and guttural, ancient Old Slavonic. He spit blasphemies that were not random curses but were so precise, so theologically inverted. They felt like a surgical vivisection of my own faith. It used my own academic arguments against me, twisting Augustine's ideas into a celebration of the void, mocking my intellectual pride. "There is no evil," it rasped in perfect academic Latin, "only the absence of your weak God, and we are the glorious, beautiful void. We are the privatio boni you wrote about so cleverly, and we have come to claim our nothingness." It knew my thoughts. It knew the secret pride I took in my intelligence. When Marco flicked holy water toward his forehead, the skin sizzled as if touched by acid, and the being wearing the cardinal's face shrieked in a high-pitched agony that vibrated through my bones and made the glass in the windows tremble. Hours passed in that cold, desecrated room. Marco was relentless, a rock against which the entity crashed and broke. He was no longer just a priest. He was a soldier, an interrogator, systematically dismantling the entity's defenses, demanding its name, its rank, and its purpose. I stood by holding the ritual book, my hands shaking so badly I could barely read the text. My role was to be the anchor, to maintain the ceaseless recitation of prayers while Marco engaged in direct combat. My voice was a pale, trembling imitation of Marco's iron command, cracking and faltering as the entity turned its attention to me, whispering my own secret doubts and fears back into my ear. As dawn approached, its defenses weakening under the relentless assault of the right, the entity finally gave them the answers they sought. "You cast me out," it hissed from the cardinal's lips, the voice thin and reedy now, filled with ancient hatred. "But it changes nothing. My brothers feast in the halls of power. They wear the red hats and the purple robes. This house is ours now. The smoke you saw was just the beginning. This is the first secret, the terrifying core of the conspiracy. This was not a random possession of a single unfortunate man. It was a confession of an organized, strategic invasion. While the famed exorcist Father Gabriele Amorth did publicly express concerns that the devil is in the Vatican, this story takes his rhetorical warnings and turns them into a demon's direct battlefield confession. The exorcism was eventually a success. The cardinal slumped in his chair, pale and sweating, his eyes clear and bewildered for the first time. He remembered nothing of the event, only a profound and bone-deep exhaustion. The battle was won. But as I stood in the wreckage of that opulent apartment, the smell of ozone and sulfur still hanging heavy in the air, I knew with a chilling, soul-crushing certainty that we were losing the war. To understand the enemy's strategy, I needed a darker, more practical theology, one not found in any seminary textbook. A few days later, In the quiet of the Sanctum Officina, surrounded by the records of centuries of such encounters, Marco provided it. He saw the shock I was still in, the way my hand still trembled when I poured a cup of coffee. He let me sit in silence for a long time before he spoke, allowing the weight of what I had seen to settle. "What is hell, Father?" he asked me, his voice quiet. "The state of definitive self-exclusion from communion with God and the blessed," I recited from the Catechism, the answer automatic and sterile, a student's answer. "That is true," Marco said, leaning forward across his desk. "But it is incomplete. That is the catechist's answer for the faithful. It is a description of a destination. We are not catechists. We are cartographers of enemy territory. We need to understand the terrain, the nature of the beast." He then revealed a piece of lore, a terrifying cosmology supposedly pieced together over centuries from the forced confessions of countless exorcisms, like the one I had just witnessed. "Hell," Marco whispered, his voice dropping as if the walls themselves might be listening, "was not created by God as a prison for the rebellious. That is a human misunderstanding, a comforting simplification. It is a place the first demons created for themselves, a kingdom built from their own rebellion, a dimension constructed out of the very essence of pride, hatred, and the rejection of God's creation. They are not merely prisoners there, they are its architects and its rulers. And like all architects, they seek to build. Like all kings, they seek to expand their kingdom." This single idea reframed the entire conflict. The enemy wasn't just a force of corruption, whispering temptations into individual ears. They were colonizers. Their ultimate goal wasn't just to drag individual souls down to hell, but to bring hell to earth, to remake our reality in their own horrific image, piece by agonizing piece. The smoke of Satan was not just confusion, it was terraforming. It was the atmospheric processing of our world, preparing it for a new hellish ecosystem where faith withers, hope dies, and love turns to ash. They didn't just want souls, they wanted real estate. "But if this is true," I asked, my mind reeling from the implications, my neat philosophical categories utterly useless. "If they are so powerful and so organized, are we alone in this fight? This little office against a kingdom?" "No," Marco said, and for the first time I saw a flicker of light in his weary eyes. "The battle goes all the way to the top." He then revealed the third secret of the legend, which takes a real, documented event from 1982 and dramatizes it for maximum effect. A young woman from the town of Spoleto, reportedly possessed, was brought before Pope John Paul II during a general audience. The official account, as reported by Vatican journalists and those present, is that the Pope saw her agitation, stopped, and offered a special prayer for her, after which she became calm. It was reported as a moment of pastoral kindness, a gentle shepherd caring for a troubled member of his flock. It was a nice story, safe and reassuring. But in the story Marco told, the one kept in the black-bound files of the Sanctum Officina, it was a direct, personal confrontation. The woman wasn't just in the crowd. She was brought by her desperate family into the Pope's private chapel after the general audience, a last desperate resort after all other avenues had failed. As she entered the sacred space, the entity within her erupted in an uncontrollable rage. She began screaming blasphemies in a language her own family didn't recognize, thrashing so violently that her handlers could not hold her. The Pope did not perform the full lengthy rite of exorcism. He simply approached the convulsing woman, his presence radiating a palpable authority that was absolute and overwhelming. He looked directly into her eyes, past the hate-filled gaze of the entity, and issued a simple, quiet command in the name of Christ, for the demon to depart from her. According to Marco, after a final violent moment of resistance where the woman's body went rigid and an inhuman scream tore from her throat, the entity receded. It fled. The woman collapsed, exhausted but freed, weeping in the sudden holy silence of the room. The purpose of this detail in the narrative is clear and profound. It confirms the stakes of the war. It establishes that the Pope himself is not just a distant shepherd or a head of state. but an active frontline combatant wielding the highest authority. It meant that our small secret unit was not some forgotten, desperate holdout, but a surgical instrument acting, however indirectly, on behalf of the Church's ultimate commander. We were not alone. And that knowledge gave me the strength to continue, to face what was coming next. The narrative then weaves in one of the most tragic and enduring real-world mysteries in modern Italian history: the 1983 disappearance of 15-year-old Emanuela Orlandi, the daughter of a Vatican employee who vanished without a trace. The case has never been officially solved. It is a national trauma for Italy, a deep wound that has never healed, filled with endless, conflicting theories involving international intelligence agencies, the Turkish Grey Wolves, the Italian Mafia, and attempts to free the Pope's would-be assassin Mehmet Ali Akka. But in the dark world of this secret war, the event is given a terrifyingly specific and spiritual explanation. This explanation comes through what the legend calls the fifth secret, the dialogue with the devil. It's a core element of exorcism lore, the belief that under the extreme duress of the rite, an entity can be forced to reveal truths it desperately wants to hide. It is described as the most dangerous and unreliable form of intelligence gathering known to man, as these beings are the fathers of lies. I was instructed to take the lead in exorcising a low-level Vatican functionary, a man who worked in the prefecture for the papal household. The possession was less dramatic than the cardinal's, but in many ways more insidious. This was not a violent takeover, but a quiet, creeping corruption that manifested as paranoia, obsession, and a quiet desecration of his duties. He would subtly misfile important documents or whisper gossip to poison relationships. After hours of resistance in a sterile, modern office room, making little progress, I remembered Marco's training. Wounded pride, he had taught me, is a powerful lever against these entities. I began to taunt the demon, calling it insignificant, a bottom feeder, a mere parasite unworthy of its host. The entity, which had been sly and evasive, began to grow angry. It started to boast of its master's power, of a pact between men of the cloth and dark powers, of services rendered and prices paid. A chilling intuition, a cold dread washed over me. I felt a connection forming in my mind between this boast of a dark pact and the great unsolved crime that haunted the city. Emanuela Orlandi, I said, the name dropping into the quiet room like a stone. What about the girl? The demon's confession is the fourth secret. Non un rapimento, it hissed, the voice thick with a sound of pure malice and triumph. Not a kidnapping. Un sacrificio, a sacrifice. It claimed the girl's disappearance was a demonically orchestrated mega-ritual. A human sacrifice, performed by human hands but designed and empowered by a demonic mind, intended to create a permanent spiritual wound, a festering gateway of darkness, in the very shadow of St. Peter's Basilica. This is where the legend draws directly on public speculations made by Father Gabriele Amorth, who suggested the girl was taken for sinister parties involving satanic rites. But the story takes his theory to its most dramatic and horrific conclusion. This theory, it must be stressed, remains entirely unsubstantiated by any public evidence. The demon didn't name the human hands involved, but it gave the why. Orlandi's disappearance, in this telling, becomes the linchpin of the demonic invasion, an act of profound metaphysical warfare, a desecration of innocence so profound it could tear a hole in the fabric of reality, hiding in plain sight as a common, albeit tragic crime. It was an offering to consecrate their foothold on holy ground. The demon's horrifying confession that Emanuela Orlandi's disappearance was a sacrifice suggested the ritual required more than just a victim. It required a focal point, an anchor, a ritual object to channel and direct the horrific energy of the act. This revelation shifted our investigation from possessed people to the terrifying possibility of possessed objects, a concept that was even more foreign to my academic mind. Our search began in the Vatican's vast archives, poring over acquisition logs for gifts and antiquities received around that time. It was a painstaking, tedious process, like looking for a single poisoned grain of sand on a vast beach. Days blurred into nights spent under the dim light of library lamps, my eyes aching from staring at endless columns of handwritten entries. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we found something that didn't fit. The entry, buried in a logbook from late 1982, flagged a recent gift given to a high-ranking official. A piece of dark, unadorned obsidian, supposedly an archaeological relic from a pre-Christian temple site in the Middle East, known for human sacrifice. To the outside world and to the official who received it, it was an academic curiosity, a handsome paperweight. To the Sanctum Officina, it looked like a Trojan horse. After much delicate maneuvering and calling in favors that Marco had accumulated over decades, we were granted access to the secure archival vault where the artifact was being temporarily stored for cataloging. A skeptical Monsignor, the curator of the collection, accompanied us, clearly annoyed by our intrusion and our lack of a clear official mandate. The moment the heavy steel door opened, I felt it, a tangible pressure in the air, a low subsonic hum that vibrated in my bones and made the hairs on my arms stand up. There, on a red velvet pedestal inside a climate-controlled glass case, sat the stone. It was pure, polished black, seemingly absorbing the light around it, creating a small pocket of unnatural shadow in the brightly lit room. The investigation, as told in the story, used a blend of faith and science. A sensitive electromagnetic field meter was brought near the glass case. The needle, which had been stable, jumped violently into the red, chattering against its pin as if registering a massive power surge. "Faulty wiring in this old building," the skeptical Monsignor scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Perhaps," Marco said calmly. He unstoppered his vial of holy water and with great care sprinkled a single line of it on top of the glass case. Instantly, a thin wisp of acrid black smoke rose from the glass where the water touched it, and a faint, high-pitched scream echoed for a bare second before vanishing. The Monsignor's face went white. His skepticism evaporated in a heartbeat. He crossed himself, stumbling back a step, his eyes wide with a terror I now recognized all too well. He had heard it too. This is the sixth secret made manifest. Evil can be bound to objects. The enemy has its own terrible artifacts, its own twisted sacraments, cursed items that can act as gateways for their influence and beacons for their forces. With the now trembling Monsignor's permission, I put on a pair of consecrated linen gloves and opened the case. The low hum grew louder, the pressure more intense. As my gloved fingers brushed the stone's cold, unnaturally smooth surface, a vision was burned directly into my mind. I didn't see it with my eyes, I saw it with my soul. I saw a black, pulsating web of dark energy spreading from the stone, a spider's web connecting points of shadow all across Rome and deep within the Vatican itself. I saw the contorted face of Cardinal Aluni in his agony, the tormented functionary I had just exorcised, and a horrifying flash of a young, terrified girl being dragged into darkness. I saw other faces, men of power I recognized from the halls of the Curia, their forms shrouded in shadow, all nodes in this horrific living web of corruption. It was not a series of random events. It was an organized, centrally controlled invasion, and this stone was its command and control center. Then a name echoed in the depths of the vision. Not spoken, but known with absolute certainty. The name of the mind behind the web. The seventh and most terrible secret. The architect. The vision shattered, throwing me physically back from the pedestal. I stumbled, gasping for air, the horrific images seared into my memory. Marco rushed to my side, his hand steadying me. "The name, Father. Did you get a name?" he asked, his voice urgent. I choked it out, a name that felt like poison on my tongue. I had the name of the true enemy. This wasn't just any demon from the pit. This was a high-ranking strategist, a general in Hell's army, a being of immense intellect and power. The smoke of Satan was not just chaos. It was a deliberately created smokescreen to hide the methodical, patient, and terrifyingly intelligent work of the architect. The question was no longer what was happening, or even how. It was, how do you exorcise a conspiracy? How do you fight an enemy who is woven into the very fabric of the institution you are trying to protect? In the story, finding the name of the architect was not a victory. It only revealed the impossible scale of the war. It was like finally seeing the full size of the iceberg after your ship had already struck it. Our findings were reported through the secure, anonymous channels Marco had established. For a few weeks, there was a flurry of silent, invisible activity across the Vatican. Certain powerful officials were quietly and suddenly reassigned to distant, powerless posts for health reasons. Certain gifts and archaeological artifacts were removed from collections and buried in the deepest sub-basements of the Vatican Apostolic Archive, sealed sections from which nothing ever returns. There was no public unmasking, no great cleansing, no grand confrontation. The institution, as it always does, protected itself from scandal at all costs. The wound was cauterized, but the infection was left to fester in the dark. Instead, the hammer fell on us. The Sanctum Officina, the instrument that had uncovered the threat, was now seen as a threat itself. Its very existence was a liability. Father Marco was promoted to an obscure, forgotten diocese on the other side of the world, a gilded cage from which he could do no more harm to the established order. The unit was officially and completely dissolved, its records sealed and expunged from all official records. I was given a quiet country parish far from Rome, and a stern, unspoken warning to remain silent forever. The official story, whispered down from on high, was that the crisis, a minor internal affair, had been successfully and completely averted. But I knew the truth. We hadn't won. We had, at best, merely exposed a single beachhead, forcing the enemy into a tactical retreat. The war wasn't over. It had simply been covered up. The architect was still out there. The web was still active. For 40 years, I held my silence. I obeyed. I became a simple parish priest. I ministered to my flock. I baptized their children and buried their dead. I offered mass and heard confessions, and I tried to live the quiet life I had been assigned. But I never stopped watching. I never stopped listening. The knowledge of what I had seen, of what I knew to be real, was a constant, heavy weight upon my soul. Every time I read a news report of another scandal, another bitter division within the church, another crisis of faith, I couldn't help but see the subtle signs of a master strategist's hand at work, fanning the flames of discord. The smoke, I believe, is rising once more, thicker and darker than before. Sometimes, in the faces of people torn by doubt or despair, I saw a faint echo of the void I had witnessed in the cardinal's eyes. I saw the architect's work in the world, in the growing chaos and the fading light. I am an old man now. My hands tremble and my eyes are weak. I can no longer fight. I break my sacred vow of silence, not because I can change the outcome, but because I believe the world must know that the battle is real, that the war is real, that the smoke Pope Paul VI saw was never just a metaphor. He saw the first signs of a fire that was intended to burn the whole world down. This ending is crucial to the power of the legend. It suggests the threat was only contained, not defeated, and that the enemy simply learned from its mistakes, becoming more subtle, more patient. The story of this secret war, born from a pope's pained observation, becomes its own kind of warning, a narrative framework for understanding a world slipping into chaos and a loss of faith. And it leaves you with the same terrifying question I ask myself in the quiet of every sleepless night. If the secret soldiers in this story weren't enough to stop it then, who will be able to stop it now?